Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on True North, and in a bit of a different venue than we normally do for the show. I guess that's par for the course lately, because we did the live show in Ottawa a couple of weeks back at the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference. There is no studio audience here. I am in a hotel room in Montreal, so you have to do, when you're doing a show from a hotel, that like one angle where no one sees your messy bed from the night before. So that's the angle I'm sitting in now. If I tilt the camera 1 inch in either direction, I'll just look like a big old slob on camera, more than usual, I guess. So don't answer that. But it is good to talk to you. It is Tuesday, April 4th, 2023. Hope you gone through April Fool's Day without any particularly acute pain, apart from, of course, the increase in the carbon tax, which just makes the jokes for people. When tax increase is going up on April Fool's Day, it just writes the lines for the opposition. But alas, that was not enough to elicit a bit of shame from the government and perhaps hold back on that, which is why we spent some time talking about that with Sylvain Charlebois last week. And interestingly enough, I had mostly good feedback to that interview with the Dalhousie professor, but I had one negative comment who said, why didn't I instead talk to producers of food in this country? And I said to him, I would absolutely do that. If you have any recommendations, please send them along, because I don't think that one person has all the answers. But I must say, I do think Sylvain Charlebois is very level-headed about this, especially when he takes aim at supply management, when he talks about the effect of carbon tax, when he talks about all of the supply chains. And I liked his prescription for this, quite frankly, which is get rid of sales tax on all grocery store products, on all food products. Don't do this little silly thing where, well, sometimes a product's a snack and sometimes it's a grocery and the size depends on it and all of that. So we'll definitely talk about this more, because, as I said, Canadians are certainly left holding the bag when the government allows inflation to be as bad as it is right now. So we're going to do things a little bit differently today. I'm going to have an interview later on with Tracey Wilson about firearms. We spoke at the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference, but with the recommendations from the Nova Scotia Mass Casualty Commission report, there is, I think, perhaps a bit more timeliness to that interview. And I also want to talk about a different side of the Chinese foreign interference story. I want to talk about the CSIS angle, because we've been talking about the politics of it, what China's doing, what Justin Trudeau didn't do. But let's go back and discuss for a moment, when we have Andrew Kirsch on, a former CSIS intelligence officer, that idea of what goes into these documents, of what the leak really is. Was it a whistleblower? Is it a leaker? And I think Andrew Kirsch goes against where a lot of other conservatives are on this issue, but I still think he's a thoughtful guy, so I want to hear him out on it. But let's start off with the big news this week, which is the federal court hearing on the Emergencies Act. The government, you may remember, it feels like a long time ago, but a year ago in February invoked the Emergencies Act. It was Justin Trudeau's big, bold, chest-thumping stand against the peaceful trucker convoy protest. And the Emergencies Act has been the subject of several legal challenges. 3 in particular are being heard this week. One by the Canadian Constitution Foundation, one by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and one by Frontline Nurses, which is an advocacy group that is a bit more aligned, I think, with where the convoy was, rather than just taking the strict civil liberties angle that the CCLA and CCF are. But these 3 groups are making their cases. The first day of the hearings was yesterday. They are still underway today by the time you are watching this, most likely. Maybe they've wrapped up by the time you're watching it. Depends on when you're watching it. And the last day of the hearings is going to be tomorrow. Now, this will be the first opportunity for a judge to weigh in on the legality of the Emergencies Act. And I just want to take a moment on that, because we had the big Public Order Emergency Commission. We had the 7 weeks of witness testimony, of documentary evidence, and all of that. And certainly there was a lot that came out of that, a lot of information. But the final report from Commissioner Paul Rouleau, who is a judge, the final report was not legally binding in any way. He didn't find legal liability. He didn't find criminal or civil liability. He found what he thought was the takeaway from this and made some recommendations for the future, but that is not something that carries any legal weight. The Supreme Court will probably ultimately have to decide this, but right now it is before the federal court. After that, it goes to the Federal Court of Appeal. I'm already just writing off that, this is going to happen and it's going to be appealed, and we're going to get there. But what's interesting right now is how little the federal government even wants to have this discussion. They're doing this old trick that they love doing on cases that are related to vaccine mandates or COVID fines, where they say it's moot. We don't need to have this federal court hearing over the Emergencies Act because it is moot. The Emergencies Act is no longer in effect. Therefore, there is no reason to have this. We can all just forget about it and move on. And this was basically a once in a lifetime, because so far the Emergencies Act has only been used once, so it's once in anyone's lifetime. But it was a one-time deal as far as Canada is concerned right now. Despite the successor, the Emergencies Act being the successor to the War Measures Act, the Emergencies Act has only been used once, and that was to deal with the Freedom Convoy. So it's the kind of situation where perhaps some judicial oversight, some more guidance, some more scrutiny about whether it was appropriately applied would be a good idea. But the federal government is saying, well, we don't really need to, because if it comes up again, the circumstances are going to be different, so this decision that you get on its use here isn't really going to be applicable. And they just want to conveniently sweep it under the rug, move on, never to look at it again. In their view, they had the Public Order Emergency Commission. It vindicated Justin Trudeau. No reason to discuss any further. So that was really what dominated a lot of day one. You had the CCF and the CCLA and frontline nurses saying, no, we absolutely need to hear this. And the Attorney General's lawyer saying, Justin Trudeau's lawyer saying, it's just moot now. Don't even bother with it. We don't need to deal with this at all. And in my experience, this has been a winnable argument. That was how the federal court managed to strike down the challenge against the air travel vaccine mandate. They said it was moot. They said the mandate is no longer there. We don't need to hear it. We don't need to hear the case. Even if the government might have said they'll bring it back, we can just deal with that then. So mootness has become a big weapon for the government in the COVID era, where, again, the whole point of it is that you don't want to be litigating cases where it's purely an academic exercise, where there's no practical reality that will emerge from it. But the problem is that it is the extenuating circumstances of the last 3 years that have, in the government's view, licensed the state to do all these things that they're now saying are moot. So the reality here now is that we're supposed to just shrug our shoulders and say, well, maybe it won't come up again, so yeah, it probably doesn't matter. But I actually don't think that is the appropriate call at all, and I'm glad that the federal court judge seemed to be pushing back against this. We're going to do a full recap of the hearings on Thursday's show once we've heard all of the arguments and counter-arguments and all of that before the court. So that's going to be something to keep an eye out for, but I wanted to give you a bit of a primer on weaponized mootness, which is the federal... it sounds like such a bland word, but it is a concept that the government certainly is weaponizing against people that care about constitutional rights. We are going to talk now about Chinese interference. Now, this is a big story. It's one that's kept on going. We've discussed it mostly in a political context because I think that's where the accountability on this is also ultimately going to rely. We've had two politicians that have had to leave their caucuses over this, Han Dong, the federal Liberal, and Vincent Ke, the provincial Progressive Conservative. Both of them have insisted they did no wrong whatsoever, but there has also been a slew of damning stories both in Global News and the Globe and Mail based on CSIS reports that point fingers at these two gentlemen and several others that have not been named like they have. And, I think that these stories are in the public interest. And I think when China's interfering in Canada's elections and you have this information being put to the government and the government is not doing anything about it, it's something that the public ought to know about. But my decision on that, my perspective on that may be different and, in fact, is different from what the law says about what information can be shared with the public. And, this is why confidential, classified, secret, top secret, all of these designations exist. So I want to talk about this with Andrew Kirsch, who we had on the show about his memoir previously, I Was Never Here. He's a former CSIS intelligence officer and has a bit of a different take on this than most people on the right in Canada do. Andrew Kirsch joins me now. Andrew, good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you again. I enjoyed our last chat, which was that higher level discussion and some specifics as well about your experience in CSIS. And I wanted to actually use that experience as a jumping off point for this story, because obviously I've been covering on this show the Chinese interference stuff for several months now it's been. And I think the political side of it and the global geopolitical side of it has been well covered. But we haven't actually talked about the fundamental question here of what is in these reports, these documents that have now been leaked to the Globe and Mail and to Global News, and just to put some context around how people should be interpreting what they're reading about these things. So let me just ask you, generally speaking, as someone who devoted your life for a time to service in CSIS, how did you feel when you learned that there was a leak?
Yeah, I wasn't too happy about it. I've been very defensive about the organization. I'm not happy with the leaks. I don't think that's a whistleblower. I think they're leakers. We take
explain that difference, because I know there is one.
So I think a whistleblower, and I'm not a lawyer, so don't quote me on the legal definitions, but where there is blowing the whistle on illegal activities or wrongdoing, or where I think there's some protections around releasing otherwise sensitive information where it's in this very specific, circumstances. Whereas in this case, I think it was just a situation where the person took sensitive classified documents and kind of dumped them on the public. And I don't think they exposed certainly no wrongdoing of the organization. These were reports that were sent out and through appropriate channels. And this person felt like they wanted more people to read them, which is not in our independent, we're not allowed to make those decisions independently on the collection side, right? Like CSIS has its role, which is to collect, analyze, and advise government on threats to national security. And then the deciders decide, right? We may not always be happy with what they decide, but that's the way it kind of works. That's how the system works together. So, when I see somebody kind of breaching on the advising part because they don't feel like the deciders made the right decision, I said, well, that's not our job. That's not on people's, that's not their decision to make. And that's why I felt, I said, not very comfortable, because there are repercussions, ramifications, right? When we are out there, when I was out there, we're talking about last time as an intelligence officer, knocking on doors and asking people to give me confidential, secret, information that I can then, put in reports and investigate national security. I'm promising confidentiality. I'm saying the things you tell me, will be protected, and take that oath. And when we work with our partners in Five Eyes community, we give them the same promise of protection and maintaining the integrity of the information. So when it gets out, it's a really bad look. Now, in this case, I think it's our own information that we've compromised. So I don't know if our partners will be upset with us, but it's, this is sensitive stuff. These are things, I'm not sure the specific sources of them, but it really does get into sources and methods, and maybe people can make some observations about how this information was collected. And so those people we're investigating can better protect themselves from our investigative measures, right? Which is, what we don't want to happen. So I mean, it's a long answer, but don't like it. I know many of my former colleagues don't like it. I'm sure the organization doesn't like it. And whatever we think about the value of the information we have, a lot of people say, well, this is good that we know about these things. It's important to remember there's a cost to that as well. There's a risk when our information gets out like this. So I just don't want to forget that.
Now, I would just point out here, you're a former Conservative candidate provincially in 2018, so I don't know how you identify politically now, but you're not a partisan Liberal. This isn't coming from a place of supporting the Liberals, which is, I think, where a lot of the defense of your position on that has come from in the last couple of months.
You know what? It's really been interesting. So I put out a tweet on I don't tweet a lot. I don't love social media, but
that's probably good. That's probably wise.
I know. So I may be a bad candidate, but I put out a tweet about how I did not appreciate the leaks. I did not like the whistleblowers, column there in the Globe and Mail saying, this is why I did it. The person who called himself a whistleblower, I just said he was a leaker. This is why I did it, and all these things. So, I wrote what I think was a harsh but fair kind of a Twitter thread, and it was retweeted by liberal supporters and partisans, and I'm sure some bots. And I kind of joked myself, wait till they find out that I ran for the PCs. There's a lot of people things with I hate Doug Ford in the hashtags, and I was like, I ran. So in my opinion, this is a nonpartisan issue. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. All parties are at risk. All levels of government are at risk. It doesn't have to be a partisan issue. It's become one, unfortunately. But yeah, it's definitely been a talking point on one side. And I said, coming from a former PC candidate in 2018, yeah, by no means a partisan liberal supporter. I think you can safely say that.
But let's take the position you've put forward and advance it a bit, because I agree that whistleblower protections generally are when someone is exposing legal wrongdoing, and generally within their own organization. And in this case, I think actually CSIS comes off quite well in the leak, and it's the government that comes off not particularly well. But assuming we take it all at face value, and we'll get into that in a couple of moments, we have allegations that China was interfering, that CSIS knew about it, that they had some very specific examples of politicians and candidates that were either involved or were the passive beneficiaries of this support. CSIS takes this to the government, and it looks like the government did not take this seriously. I think that's what the reports that we've seen have shown. So what is the proper recourse? Because there's a part of what you're saying that it sounds like it's just to say, oh, well, the government had that call and maybe another government will take it differently.
Well, you're saying on behalf of the leaker or the people who are so.
Well, I'm trying to understand what your position is on what should have happened in this case, if anything. If someone were very frustrated that this was getting handed to the government and they weren't taking it seriously.
Well, look, it kind of goes to our previous point there. I ran for office. You want to be a decision maker? You go and become a decision maker. You want to go work for a political party. You think that things are not happening that you want to see happen. You volunteer, you get involved, you be a public person, you advocate for your positions. You don't have to necessarily put your name on the ballot, but you can go be a staffer and try to go to a ministry or some area that you're passionate about and knowledgeable about and say, these are the policy positions that I think that we should take. I think that, more than anything is probably my frustration because if this person, and I don't know who this person is or whether they work for CSIS or not, and I think it's a lot of people, I guess, is what we're seeing too. If they were a very public senior person that had access to this information and they was, resign their post and said, the reason I'm resigning is because I don't think we're taking this issue seriously. There are a lot of public reports that they can point to that would demonstrate that. I mean, we have what INSIRA, I always get the acronyms wrong, so apologies for that, but the INSIRA and NCCOP, we've been doing, CSIS has been putting out reports on foreign interference for years. The CSIS has been reviewed and the recommendations have come from parliamentary committees or NCCOP that's nonpartisan, that's chaired by a Liberal MP, and they're saying their recommendations, things that we should be doing. Those recommendations haven't been adhered to. So there's plenty of public information that suggests that this is a problem that should be actioned without just kind of dumping the sensitive reporting on it into the public. I think that so. Yeah, that was one of my points to the person to say, hey, look, come on out, put your name to it. Like, let's talk about it if you want to talk about it, and not in a threatening way, but like, I think that would almost do better. I was in a meeting and I don't think we did a good job with this and we should do better. For me, that's a more convincing argument, to be honest, than letting this play out this way.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, my view on this, and you may have some people that, whether you call them a leaker or a whistleblower, they think they're smarter than the system and they think they can leak it and keep their identity guarded and never be outed. But you would have to assume that someone doing this, knowing what they're doing, would be doing it with the full expectation that they're going to be identified and they're going to be punished in some way, whatever that is. And in that way, it almost looks more favorably upon you if you do just come out and name yourself before someone else names you.
Yeah. And I don't want to, harp on too much on the one person, and as I don't know the situation and who that person is, right? But this is coming from somebody who wrote a book. I mean, I wrote a memoir about working for CSIS, and you better believe that I was concerned about considered and was concerned about my Security Information Act obligations. And they say you're only kind of guilty when the judge finds you guilty, but I had my name and my face in the book, and so I was ready to say this is why I said it. This is what I think. It's not in violation. I didn't do names of former colleagues or any operational information that can give things away. But I acknowledge people might be mad at me. I acknowledge that the CSIS was not going to be happy about the book being written. So yeah, it's not a great feeling. I'm sure the person has got all sorts of stuff going on inside of them about what they feel they need to do, what they feel they want the public to hear, and what their obligations are. But yeah, I think that maybe would have been if they really want to have that conversation, you got to kind of have it. You got to lead it. You got to be in front of it, because what's happened with things are coming left and right and showing up in newspaper articles one day and the next article the next day, it kind of gets away. It can get a little muddled.
I assume there's not, one centralized database of CSIS documents and information and reports that any of the, 3,000 some odd employees at CSIS can go and peruse at their leisure. Things are, I assume, quite siloed and segmented. So let's talk about just the logistics of how many people would likely have access to information of this nature on a particular file. And I'm assuming it would vary, but when you're getting into this level of specificity, are we talking about 5 people, 50 people, 500 people?
Well, I don't know the exact numbers, or could I probably say, but I'll say this, that, the classified or sensitive documents that were, leaked, those were distributed to a large number of people. I think they were across the Five Eyes, so the number of other intelligence services, to I think PCO, PMO. Like there's a big list. Once kind of those get out of the organization, and I don't know how many people are on that mailing list, but it's not one, right? It seemed like they were a few. And when you start getting into specific reports that were sent out, you can probably drill down who's on the receiving list of a report, who is on the inside of a case file, working specific investigations. Absolutely, that stuff is pretty tightly controlled. I think if you work with or for the service, and you can be pretty confident that they do a good job of protecting it. And to your earlier question about will this get out, the more information the people reveal about what they know, the easier it's going to be to narrow down, who had access to all of that information. I think that's ultimately what you're getting down to. They are tightly controlled. Not everyone gets access to everything. There's this you need to know principle. You hear, you may be familiar with it, but even if you have the highest levels of national security, even if you're cleared to whatever the highest clearance is, if you don't need to know that information, then you should not be provided that information. You don't get read in on every file. I can't walk down the hall at CSIS and say, "Hey, what are you working on?"
Hey, what's happening in China today? What's happening in Afghanistan today?
What's going on? What's going on over there, right? You're generally restricted to what you have specific access to. Now, certain areas would have, that can be broad. When I was working there and I was in a support desk, that can mean a lot of different files at a very kind of shallow level, a lot of different investigations, or someone working one investigation with a tight team will have all the information on, a very small investigation. So it's interesting to see as these things come out. I make assessments about, okay, like how close was this person to the reporting versus, or the collection of the information versus the reporting, which would be on, was this distributed to a decision maker, and therefore, they're getting selective intelligence and saying, why am I the only one who got this and more people need to hear? Or is it somebody who is, collecting this information, passing it up and feel like it's not going anywhere? I think those are different things.
I saw a Twitter thread from someone recently, and I can't recall who it was, and I think they probably had some connection to the intelligence world, that said intelligence reports are not to be taken as 100% ironclad fact. They're meant to be reports that are then taken along with other various inputs. We saw that during the Public Order Emergency Commission, where CSIS had this report and the government ultimately found something else. So I'm just curious if you could shine some light on that. I mean, these documents, and I don't know the formal title of them, and there are probably several. What is the proper way to receive those? Is there a margin of error on these things, or is it as certain as it comes, or as certain as CSIS is when these things are put in paper?
Yeah, I mean, the nature of intelligence, it's dynamic, it's kind of evolving. You can have, you're building a picture and you're trying to provide information and assessment of that information. You're processing information into, in this case, intelligence assessments to say, this is, what we think is happening. This is the picture. But it's, getting it right or wrong, or just making informed links, and then later on information comes up that challenges that hypothesis or changes it a little bit, or put some context and nuance onto reports. So, in a case like this, or in the fact that this is a threat like this, that CSIS is a core part of CSIS's mandate, that's, foreign influenced activities, that is kind of a nuanced threat. You will see reporting that comes out that is just trying to provide people a picture of what's going on that they can make decisions based on, right? And that's why it is gray, right? It is, you make the best decisions you can. You make risk-informed decisions, threat-informed decisions. And I think that's one of the concerns you have is, well, did this person who is access to information, they have access to everything? Or are they selectively getting access to it? Do they know what risk mitigation is put in place? So, what decisions were made with that information? That is, we don't know. That's not always provided. What kind of is happening behind the scenes? We kind of see, okay, well, they got this and they did that, but we don't know everything they got. We don't know everything they did, right? And that's, I think, one of the challenges with getting selective leaks of documents is, it's not going to provide the whole picture. I'm not saying the information passed along is wrong. I'm not saying that the documents given weren't, like, at the time, accurate pictures of what we knew then or about the specific threat then. But it's hard to say, like, this is the smoking gun, right? It's that doesn't always the case in these types of investigations.
Yeah, and it's funny because I know that some of my audience right now is like seething because we've been going hard on this story based on these reports for the last, not at you, just probably at me more than anything, because they know I've been talking about this, and it's one of these things. As a journalist, I'm inclined towards more information, and the more the better, and then we can decide from it. And I realize there is perhaps it's a philosophical point more than it's a legal point about what the limit is. At what point does it become justifiable to do this? And I think there is one sort of takeaway. If you feel it's worth staking your life and your career and the legal punishments on, then okay, let the cards fall where they may.
Well, I want to say this to folks too, because I get asked a lot about the leaks and the documents, those types of things, and I feel like I want to present that context, which is these have threats and risks, and let's add nuance to it. But I dedicated 10 years of my life to investigating threats to national security, and many of my colleagues have as well. And this is one of them, right? Mm-hmm. So I do not want to discount the risk. I do not, and the threat. I do not want to come across in any way that's saying that there's nothing to see here and nobody worried. No, that is absolutely not the case, right? The CSIS has been putting in their public reports. There have been recommendations coming out of government bodies that this is a threat, this is a concern, this is something we should do more about, and there are legitimate questions to be asked 100% about what did the government know and what did they do? And was that appropriate, right? And if they did, and then there's the nuance, which is, well, look, if they didn't do more, is that because they benefited, right? And I think everyone wants to get, and those are absolutely 100% fair questions that we should be asking, which people are calling for public inquiry or more sunlight and more transparency, and I agree. So, I don't want to discount that and be used to say, well, the leaker's not a whistleblower, and therefore, this is a big brouhaha about nothing. Absolutely not. We have an intelligence service that's been working on this. We've been sending reports up, and it is a real threat, and we should do more 100%. So yeah, I get the blowback. I get the frustration. Yeah. I always feel like because I'm from the intelligence community, I need to say, look, guys, don't put my former colleagues at risk by dumping sensitive intel out. But my goodness, there's plenty of public information that says this is a problem that we should be doing more about. This has sparked a conversation about that. And yeah, I'm not saying there's no public benefit. I'm just saying I wish we didn't get here because of leaks.
Yeah, and I agree, process is important. I mean, it's the old thing about, if police search someone without a warrant and they find something there, but they weren't allowed to have searched in the first place, there's a remedy available to that person. So I know it's not a perfectly analogous situation, but you can't just take this Machiavellian approach to these things, which I think we can agree on in principle, if not necessarily in the specific case here. You
might like this leak, you might not like the next one. And if we're going to rely on individual people who feel empowered to do it, I don't think that's a great system. So whatever we feel about this, but once again, foreign interference, that's a core CSIS mandate threat since 1984 that our Security Intelligence Service has been asked to investigate and advise government on, and they've been doing that. And now we got to figure out, so what do we do, what do we not do, why, and what should we do going forward now that we are having this conversation, because that will require further action. And as a political candidate, I have some insight in how nominations work, and those are messy things. That's no easy solutions on how to tidy those things up for the political process. But clearly, I think there are steps that we can and should take.
All right. Well, the fantastic book written by this gentleman, Andrew Kirsch, is I Was Never Here, My True Canadian Spy Story of Coffees, Codenames, and Covert Operations. You can, in the age of terrorism, you can get that on Amazon and Indigo, and I would encourage you to read it. It was a lot of fun, and you can also check my interview with Andrew from several months ago to get a little bit more information about that. Andrew, thank you so much for your time and candor, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That was former CSIS intelligence officer Andrew Kirsch, and as mentioned, you should definitely check out his book, I Was Never Here. It's not a salacious or thriller type book, but it's a tremendously valuable resource to understand a government agency in Canada that so often flies under the radar because it's not necessarily as sexy as like the Jason Bourne movies as far as what they do, but they do play a role, and as we're seeing in the course of the Chinese interference story, they were doing their part, and the government, it seems, was not doing its part. So let me know what you think about that in the comments. Turning from one agency to another, though, we spoke last week about the Mass Casualty Commission's report, and this was the commission that was struck to deal with that horrific killing spree in Portapique, Nova Scotia 2 years ago, actually pushing 3 years ago now. And the one thing that I would point out to a lot of people about this thing that I said on the show last week is that it looks like the recommendations in the report were just written by the most radical activists in each particular category. So the recommendations on domestic violence looked like they were written by activists in that sector who, again, may have a legitimate cause, but it's not one connected to what happened in Nova Scotia, at least as much as the report made it seem. And the firearms section looked like it was ripped right out of what the most rabid gun control activists in this country seek at every turn. And they just look for opportunities to advance this agenda, irrespective of the facts of the case. And in the Nova Scotia killing spree, the firearms were all illegally owned, so no changes to the legal ownership regime for guns in Canada would have done anything. But that part is conveniently left out of the narrative. A couple of weeks ago, when I was in Ottawa for the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference, I sat down with Tracey Wilson from the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, and I'm actually going to be speaking at their AGM in Ottawa in June. So if you are a CCFR member, I do hope you come out and say hello and hear what I'm speaking about. I have no idea what I'm speaking about yet because it's in June, so things could change. There's no point in writing a speech now, but it was great to see Tracey Wilson in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago as well, and we were chatting just to contextualize this before the Mass Casualty Commission report came out, but it's really, as I mentioned, a lot of the same themes and dynamics that we were discussing that are part of this bigger picture of the gun issue in Canada that were coming up that we now see reflected in that report.
You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
And joining me is Tracey Wilson, the Vice President of Public Relations for the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, a group that's always been a great supporter of True North, and I've always been a great supporter and member of them. I think it's not really breaking news to say that gun owners have been under assault with Justin Trudeau's government. We've had the Order in Council Bill, C-21, a number of reforms and regulations. And even just as we were chatting a moment ago, I mean, how do you even as a gun owner begin to tackle all of these things? Because it really is a battle on many fronts that the government's waging.
It absolutely is. And in fact, to me, as a gun owner, I've been a gun owner for 27 years. Mm-hmm. I'm a mom, I'm a grandma. I want to say for country too. And I know it's not my community committing the violence. So for me, the problem is it's sort of a breach of the social contract that I made with the government when they said, here's the regulations in order to be a gun owner. Here's what you can have. Here's what you can do. And I said, okay. And I complied with them, regardless of how ridiculous some of them are. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. They just are still coming at us, still trying to confiscate our legally acquired property, even though we've done nothing to warrant it. And it's incredibly frustrating. So frustrating that, we're taking them to court.
We've seen a little bit of optimism, I'd say, in the last few months, not from the federal government, but from provinces. I think Alberta really started this off. They appointed a very firearms owners-focused CFO, Terry Bryan. They've also now, under Danielle Smith, really said, we're not playing ball with the federal government's gun confiscation. Has this been an area where there's a bit of hope that you can lobby provincial governments in a way that might not have been top of mind for your agenda?
Yeah, well, in fact, when the CCFR first launched our federal court action back in 2020, immediately after the big sweeping gun ban, we had written to the different provinces, to the attorney generals of each province, asking them to intervene on our court challenge. And we didn't hear back from any of them. And then after Danielle Smith took over, we heard back from them. They've actually intervened they filed an application to intervene on our court challenge, and it was approved by the Associate Chief Justice of the Federal Court. So Alberta's all in. Saskatchewan's right behind them. Manitoba, Yukon, and New Brunswick have all been very vocal against this.
Not Ontario, though.
We're still waiting that's the thing with Doug, right? I think he's perfectly comfortable where he is, and he doesn't like to rock the boat either way. At the same time, I've known Doug Ford a long time, and I know he doesn't support the war on gun owners. He knows that the problem is crime, violence, and gun smuggling.
You mentioned this a moment ago, a lot of people might not realize, because gun owners probably seem a bit rebellious to the Canadian culture, but they're very compliant by definition individuals. Yes. It's, that we get the paperwork, we get the forms, we, make sure that this is locked and this is locked. And at a certain point, you reach a breaking point, I think, where gun owners are saying it's just not worth being in this hobby anymore. And that's my fear. Are you seeing that, or are they really digging their heels in and saying, no, I'm fighting for this right to keep my property?
There's two things I'm really afraid of. Number one, people just giving up, getting rid of their stuff, and abandoning our community altogether, because it's to the people who participate, it's incredibly important. The other thing I'm afraid of is non-compliance, and I'll tell you why. I know a lot of people sort of promote that idea, but here's the thing. In any functioning civil society and democracy, you don't want people willingly breaking the law. But when you force people to that edge, when they've complied with every law and every regulation you've put before them, and then you still come at them, and the idea is you're coming to kick in their doors and take their stuff, people just say, forget it. I am sick and tired of complying because it hasn't paid off for me. So I think those are the two things that frighten me most. And thirdly, the fact that all the effort, resources, and focus is on legal gun owners. And meanwhile, we've got crime blowing up out of control all across the country, and especially in places like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver.
Yeah, and gun owners are actually the toughest people in terms of wanting to go after gun crime. The issue is just the Liberals have a very broad definition of what a gun criminal is, and they basically think a gun owner is inherently a bad person that needs all of these regulations heaped upon them.
Either that, or they at least want the public to think that, because it's very politically expedient to, beat up the opposition or to beat up their opponents with they're going to make assault weapons legal again, or scary things like that. I think down deep the Liberals know. Marco Mendicino knows. He's a Crown prosecutor in his previous business life. They've got all kinds of lawyers. They've got Bill Blair, who was chief of police in Toronto. These people know full well what they're doing isn't going to have a demonstrable public safety benefit, but they know it's going to have an actual political impact, and that's why they do it, which is horrible, and so it's un-Canadian.
Tracey Wilson, thank you.
Thank you.
That was Tracey Wilson, spokesperson for the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. As I mentioned, going to be at their AGM in Ottawa come June, so that should be a great time. I don't even know if we're going out to a range or not. Probably not, but because we're going to be in a downtown Ottawa hotel, I believe. But you never know. I need to get out to a range, actually. All of these restrictions have just made it so difficult to do anything with certain firearms in Canada. So now we are going to have to, as gun owners, if you are one of them, dig in a little bit more and make sure you don't just give up, because that was what Tracey and I were discussing there, that some people are saying, this is just too difficult a hobby to deal with, maybe it's not worth the hassle, maybe it's not worth doing it, but people need to say, no, this is our livelihood, this is our life, this is our hobby, this is our pastime, this is our sport, this is the way we feed our family in some cases. I mean, firearms mean so many different things to different people, but to the Liberals, they mean weaponry, and to the Liberals, gun owners mean criminals, and they are the ones who are radical. They are the ones who are fringe. So we can't let them reframe the narrative around law-abiding, peaceful gun owners. So that's a little bit of a teaser of what you'll see more of on the show in the months ahead as these regulations and laws continue to work their way through the system. We'll keep talking about it here. And as I've said to people, if you are not a gun owner, you surely can engage with this from a property rights perspective and from a science and evidence-based policy perspective. You don't need to like guns or know guns to realize what the government is doing here. That does it for us for today. We'll be back on Thursday with another regular edition of the Andrew Lawton Show. And as I said earlier, a post-mortem of the federal court hearing on the Emergencies Act. That's coming up in a couple days' time. Hope you have a great rest of the week, though. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.